Welcome to Obsession Engineering. For the last year and a half or so, the Tuono has been my go-to road bike, and everything I've asked it to do, it's done excellently. And then, tail end of last year, in the start of December to be a bit more precise, I went with some of the guys from Rapid up to Scotland and rode it around in some of the most hideous weather you could possibly imagine. I brought it home and I treated it very nicely and cleaned it, but because it's a warm-blooded Italian, it still took offence at being used in such conditions. And a few days later I went to the garage and it had made a little bit of a pool of oil on the floor. And I realised it was a cry for help and it wanted some TLC. So the first problem I found with the Tuono was actually before I took it to Scotland. I'd noticed a couple of little drips of oil in the belly pan and wondered where it had come from. So after a little bit of a look, I found that the seal behind the clutch slave cylinder had been just weeping a little bit. So I dried it out and it was actually fine for quite a lot of miles. So, of course, when I found a big pool of oil on my bench, I assumed it was from this seal. But it turns out it isn't. Because I know this seal is leaking, I'm going to change it anyway, but that was not the main culprit. The biggest tears the Tuono was crying were actually out of the fork seals. Now, when I took it to Scotland, I greased up right at the bottom of the seals where they don't normally get a lot of travel, and that was just to fend off any salt and bits. Then, having jumped it over a couple of big jumps down a back road in Glencoe, it actually used all the travel, and I think what's happened is any little bits of grit that were actually stuck in the grease, it's dragged up into the seals, and now the seals leak. But they leak quite extensively. Every couple of days I've been changing the sort of, wee pad on the bench, and it just keeps dripping. This side is worse than the other side. So yeah, what I need to do is put some new fork seals in it. But that puts me on to the next point. Back when I'd not long finished the Tuono, I got the luxury of riding it back to back with my mate Skiddy's factory bike with the fancy Öhlins forks in it. And the biggest difference I actually noticed was the action of the fork over the bumps. These are pretty good when they're riding fairly quickly, but the Öhlins were much nicer over bumps, especially when you're going quite slowly. So I decided if I'm going to take the forks apart to change the seals, I may as well take them a bit more apart and put a piston kit in and see if I can make these slightly cheaper forks work more like the Öhlins. Along with fixing the little oil leak and the considerably bigger oil leak, I am going to do a little bit of preventative maintenance. These Gen 2 Tuonos and RSVs, or at least the early ones, had a bit of an issue with burning out the electrical stator buried in there. In fact, they're that common for it that this bike had a burnt out stator when I got it. Now, if you want the new flywheel that is less magnetic and creates less current, if you buy it from Aprilia, it's 1,100 quid's worth of parts. But I've managed to find a chap who can derate this flywheel so it makes the 370 watts of a later one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this apart, take the flywheel off it, post it to a man, wait for him to send it back, bolt it back in, and then I will have an uprated charging system for considerably less than the price of the parts from Aprilia. So because I have to take this cover off, it means I've got to take this off, and behind this plastic cover is the oil tank with all the oil in it because it's a dry sump engine. So I need to drain the oil out of the tank from down there, disconnect the hose down here, take the tank out of the way, and then I can get to all the bolts that hold the alternator cover on, take the bolts out of the cover, take the cover off, take the flywheel off. Sounds relatively straightforward. I'm kind of hoping it is relatively straightforward. So of course I'd missed a couple of minor items. To get the top nut for the oil tank, I have to go and take the little cover off that sits down here, which involves moving that out of the way as well, because you couldn't possibly just leave this accessible, could you? Never mind. Right, the other thing I need to do is actually disconnect that hose and that hose, which isn't the end of the world. So I have a special pair of pliers with a sort of little cutout end bit and a slicey thing. That's the technical term. And what you do is you put that on there. Works better if I use them the right way up. And that unclips that one. And then if I go down here, we just go down there and go like that. Now you can undo these with, a screwdriver and a bit of a shove, but it's putting them back together that's particularly awkward. So having the right tool does make that considerably easier. And you'll notice I've written the code number for the oil filter on there as well, because there's two options on I sort of tend to forget. That's the oil tank off, and all the oil drained into my washing up bowl. I'd probably clean it out before I actually do the washing up later. Right, I had also forgotten that pipe up there and the bolt that sits behind there, but they're minor details really. Right, before I take the cover off, I'm just going to have a little bit of a clean round so that when I split it, I don't end up with bits of horrible weather and stuff falling into the engine. So we don't want any of that. And I'm also going to take the sensor out of the top of there and sort of hide it out of the way. I can't actually take the cover off completely because when I installed the new Stator, I hardwired the wiring in to the other side of the bike. So what I'm going to have to do is sort of just move this out of the way as best I can so that I can get to the flywheel. That's a problem for a few minutes' time though. I've had a little clean up around the outside of the case so when we split it we don't get dirt anywhere. I've used one of the bolts from the slave cylinder in one of the fairing fast rolls so I can just tuck these bits out of the way up there, and the bolt that clamps the little clip-on that holds all those pipes out of the way I've screwed into where the slave cylinder goes, so everything's sort of just tucked out of the way so the area I'm working in doesn't have anything sort of falling into it. So the next thing I need to do is give this a bit of a wiggle to get it off the engine. That might take a bit of doing because the magnet for the flywheel is actually trying to pull the cover onto the engine all the time. But normally, with a bit of heaving, it'll pop off without too much trouble. Right, we're nearly there. Bit of wiggling. And come on, you little bugger. Now it's just pulling on the magnet, which is quite strong. And there we go. The cover is off and I can see my flywheel. I've been round to the other side of the bike and snipped off a couple of cable ties that were holding some of this wiring sort of out the way on the far side so that I can just pull the cover out the way, and I've just cable tied it up there so it's, you know, sturdy and not all hanging on the wiring. So that's tucked out the way. So the next thing I need to do is try and take the flywheel off, which is a little bit of fun because that nut will be really, really tight and then the flywheel is sort of pressed onto the end of the crank. So it's time to get the big boy tools out. So according to the manual, to hold the crank in position so I can undo the big nut, I put a bolt in here which locks the crank because it locks it at top dead centre as if you're putting the cams in it. So that is locking that in place, and now I can go around the other side and put a big bar on it and turn it round. And hopefully everything will come undone without horrible snapping noises and bits of metal falling in the bottom of the engine, because that would be very disappointing. I think that's what they call cut. Now I've got the big nut out, what I need to do is put a flywheel puller in that goes onto these threads here, and then in the middle of the puller there's basically a bolt that pushes on the crank and separates the two. But the man from Aprilia, or actually the man from Rotax who made the engine, has Loctited this onto the end of the crank, even though there's a little keyway and everything. So it is not going to come off easily, and they actually recommend you heat it up with a warm air gun for 5 to 10 minutes, but not using an open flame, because that sets fire to things that they don't want setting fire to. So I'm going to get the heat gun on it for a few minutes, find the correct flywheel puller, and see if we can make it pop off. This has been warmed up for a good few minutes. The flywheel puller is in. So now it's just a case of giving it a bit of a tweak and hoping it comes off. But in my experiences of flywheels, it will either fall off with absolutely no effort at all, or in about an hour's time I'm going to be blue in the face and screaming at it. Let's hope it's the former. Falling off is not high on the agenda here, is it? Right, after resorting to the thing that Aprilia said not to do and using a blowtorch, something's happened. But I do need a pair of gloves to see if the thing that's happened is the thing I wanted to happen. Oh, no, it's definitely loose. I think we've actually got it off. Yeah, it's off. But give it a minute to cool down, though. So now I have the flywheel off and cooling down on the bench, which will probably take about a week, I've just popped the engine cover back on and the oil tank back on, just so all the oil lines and everything and the engine is sealed up. But they're only loose, so it is still dripping a little bit of oil on the bench. So that side of it's done. I just need to post the flywheel off. So now I can move on to the next bit. So with the alternator rotor off the bike, I split the starter clutch bits off the rotor and I've posted that off to its man to be derated. So the next job I'm going to do is attack the oil seal for the clutch push rod. So this little seal down here doesn't leak a lot, but it does weep a little bit, and while we're taking stuff apart we may as well change it. So I'm hoping that I can get a little pick underneath it and just literally flick it out the hole. But it's very rare that these things are that easy. Little hook in the back of there, and literally, he says, give it a bit of a pull, and it should come out the hole. And there we go, an oil seal. So this is my new oil seal, and it's brown because this one's made of Viton or something, which is slightly uprated against the material of the original. But interestingly, because I bought this from a generic bearing supplier, this was just over £4. Whereas if you want to buy an original one from Aprilia, you probably get slightly less quality for the £28 asking price. So this is a case of it's just going to literally slide in the hole. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a socket or something that can go over it to sort of drift it into place. And I'm going to put a smear of grease on the inner ring so when it's sliding down the shaft, it isn't going to sort of pull any of the rubber. Right, so here we go. I have a generous smear of grease in my seal, and I've put a smear of grease on the shaft as well because we all want a nice lubricated hole to get into. So the next thing to do is slide that down there, give it a bit of a wiggle, and then we need to drift it into the hole. And for that I'm using a 16mm deep reach socket because it fits over everything and it's a nice fit around the outer diameter, and a hammer. So we'll get that about there and just nice and gently tap the seal into place. There we go, one oil seal fitted into its hole. Before I put all the slave cylinder and the sprocket cover and bits back on though, I will have a clean up around here and get rid of a bit of the old chain lube. Save a bit of weight while we're in there. So with my oil seal fitted, now I'm onto the forks and the bit that should make an actual improvement to how the bike rides. The whole time I've been riding the bike, after riding Skiddy's factory, I've sort of just kept noticing this slight harshness to the forks over the bumps, and I was toying with upgrading something inside, and now that the fork seals are leaking, it's the perfect opportunity to take them apart and do everything I wanted to do. So what's the plan? Well, it's going to be brake calipers off, front mudguard off, and then we'll get the stand under the headstock, take the front wheel out, and just slide each fork leg out. Nice and easy. So now I've got the brake calipers off, the front wheel out, and the mudguard off, the next thing I need to do is take the fork legs out. But before I slide them out, I'm just going to measure exactly how high they're sitting in the yokes, so that when I put them back in, we've got the same geometry. 7mm, and that includes the top cap. So then just undo the yokes. And my fork leg should slide out, but the yokes are a little tight. Is even though the yokes are undone, they're a little bit snug, so they're dragging a little bit on the fork. So I'll just put a little bit of lubrication on it so that when they slide out, they're not scratching the fork tubes. And because they're still tight, what I'm just going to do is just get a screwdriver in there and just very lightly flex the yoke open a little bit to take the tension off the fork leg. There we go, one leg out, same routine for the other one. So I'm now up in my suspension area and I've done a few little bits before I start stripping the forks down. I've measured all the settings on it, so I've checked the preloads, the rebound, the compression damping settings on it, and I've also given everything a little bit of a clean so that when I'm taking it apart I'm not going to risk getting anything dirty inside. I've also cracked off the top cap, but now I'm going to turn it around and I'm going to try and loosen off the bolt in the bottom that holds the damper rod in place, holds the cartridge in place, because while everything's under a bit of spring tension inside there, it sometimes holds it all enough that you can get the bolt sort of fairly loose, and it just makes the job a little bit easier for later. So the idea of this is just to loosen off the bolt that holds the cartridge in place. In fact, it might even, if it comes to it, it might even take the bolt out, which isn't the end of the world. And that just means it's easier than trying to hold the cartridge later with one hand and try and undo the bolt. So if it comes undone, easy. If not, we will have to get in later with a cartridge holding tool. Right, well, it's loosened that at least a little bit. I'm not going to take it all the way out yet. Now what I'm going to do is turn the fork the other way back up and take the top end off. Right, so I've loosened the top cap a little bit when it was in the vise earlier. You can always crack the top off a little bit when it's in the bike, but my vise holds it pretty well, so now we can just unscrew this and drop the cartridge, drop the tube down a bit. And now I need to put it in the spring compressor, push this tube down to get to the nut that holds the top cap to the cartridge. So with the spacer tube for the preload wedged in the spring compressor, I can then wind the spring compressor down. Always goes the wrong way first. And that is just an easy way of doing it. You can buy little sort of hand tools for pushing the spring down, or in the past me and my mate have done them with a pair of Allen keys back in the day. But this is by far the easiest way. Right, that should be far enough. So then I can lift this up and I can get to that locking nut there, which locks the preload spacer, like the top cap, to the actual tube of the cartridge. So now I just need a couple of spanners to undo those. So then we can just get on the lock nut and the fork top, take the fork top off. And that has the tube on it that goes to the rebound adjusting needle. So now, pretty easy. Take the tension off the spring, and I can turn it upside down, pour all the old oil away. So now we're starting to get into the interesting bits. We've got the top cap with the rebound tube, the preload spacer, the spring, some little spacery bits, and then this is the cartridge that sits inside the forks. This bit attaches to the fork top, so that goes up and down. That bit is attached to the fork bottom and doesn't go up and down, or arguably goes up and down with the wheel when this bit's stationed with the bike. But either way, they move like that, and inside there's a couple of little things with shim stacks on them. So we need to take this apart, and if we go down to this end, I've just pushed the compression damping sort of block in there, and in the hole in here there is just a little circlip, and if I flick that out I can pull the cartridge, the compression bit out the cartridge. So I've taken out the circlip that retains this in the bottom of the cartridge. This is the compression stack, so that just sort of lives up in there, up about there, and then those holes let the oil flow in and out of the cartridge. So that sits about there. We can put that over there on the blue roll. It's not loo roll, it's blue roll. And then if I take the nut off the end of here, talk amongst yourselves, then I can push this all the way down there, and that is the rebound stack on its little rebound piston, or in fact on the piston for the damper rod. So we'll slide that out, put that over here as well, and the next thing to do is to strip these down and change the pistons and the shims for the new ones I've got from K-Tech. In here we've got completely new compression stacks with the bit that goes in the fork bottom. The piston's different. In effect, this side is the non-return valve, so when the oil's flowing this way, it goes up the holes in here and just pushes these out of the way, like that. But when the fork is in compression and the piston there is pushing downwards, it's forcing oil down the slightly smaller holes in there and against these shim stacks, and then obviously the more pressure, it opens these shims up, and they're stiff enough you can't really do it with your fingers. Now, if you open your compression adjuster, what that does is it lets oil go through this bypass hole, completely misses out the shim stacks, goes out the fork bottom and through the sort of drilling in the fork bottom. So when you're changing your settings, you're not actually changing the shim stacks and bits at all, you're only changing the amount of oil that goes past the bypass and doesn't use this bit. So when you hit bumps and things and this hole can't flow any more oil, then it has to go through the shim stack, and that's why over bumps and stuff especially, this makes more difference. This in effect is your high speed damping, that bit's, just the low speed stuff. So that is the compression one, and then there is a completely new shim stack for the rebound. Again, similar thing, we've got a little non-return valve there, so when this is in when this is in compression, the oil just goes up a hole up there and flicks this straight out the way up here, so the oil sort of passes by without any particular resistance. But then in rebound, when this is going upwards, because it's attached to the fork top, then the oil has to go through that hole there and push against this shim stack. And again, there is a bypass, so the oil can go up the end, through the bypass and out without having to go through the shim stack. Fairly straightforward. In fact, if we have a look at this, so this is the fork top with the needle on the end of it. This is the adjuster for the bypass. So in effect, this sort of sits in here. And if you can just see down that hole, it opens and closes the amount of flow through that hole, and the needle on it obviously alters how much you screw it in and out. So hopefully that all makes sense. What we've also got in this kit is we've actually got new ends for the rebound adjuster. So the taper is a lot smoother on this. It's a longer taper, so this should give a little bit more control, but it does mean I have to cut the end off the fork cap tube thing that does the rebound and fit these instead. So there is a little bit of work to do, but it don't be too bad. So these are two rebound stacks, and they are quite different. It's sort of almost ignoring the bit that they just bolt to, because that's not quite so relevant. The rebound thing on them, the compression sort of non-return valve pretty much does the same thing on both ones. But then when you actually get into the rebound stack, the shim stack that we're really interested in, see these ones, there's an interesting selection of different size shims, and they're sort of free to move wherever they want really. Whereas these ones, there's a relatively limited number of quite big shims, but then they're only allowed to open, realistically, a fraction of a millimetre before they hit this sort of solid washer. So that's why these ones feel quite harsh over the bumps, because there's not that much range of sort of motion where they work over. So these ones should be considerably better. So these are the two rebound adjusting needles. This is the tube that goes into the fork top. I've just screwed it out the fork top for now. And you can see the difference in the taper. This one's a lot more gradual and a lot longer. So in effect you have sort of more adjustment, and you should get a nicer flow of oil through here. And the spring is just there because this one is attached to the rod and this one won't be. So that spring is just to keep it pushed against the rod so it doesn't just fall in the hole and lock the hole off. So it's a pretty similar story to how it was on the rebound. There's a non-return valve bit up there, and then this is the shim stack that actually does the compression work. And as you can see, on the K-Tech one there's a good range of shims, so we'll get a reasonable damping over a different range of damping speeds. Whereas the originals, they're a couple of shims, it's fairly limited, and there's not a great deal going on with that. So the next thing to do is put new oil seals in the fork leg. So I've slid the dust seal down out of the way. There is a circlip you can just see in there, which I'll flick out of the way with a screwdriver, and then in effect I have to get hold of this bit and pull it quite sharply that way to pull the seals and the bushes out of here. So now I've got the two tubes apart, it's all fairly straightforward in here. There is a bush at the top of here, which slides inside the sort of outer tube. There is a bush here that actually stays solid inside the tube and slides against this stanchion. There's a washer, and then there's just the fork oil seal and the dust seals down the bottom. So all I've got to do is slide each one of these off in turn, slide the fork seal off, slide the new one on, put it all back together. So I've given everything a decent clean. I've cleaned up inside the dust seals and I've made sure there's no pitting or marks, scratches or anything on the chrome, and everything's looking pretty good. And I've put a little condom on the over at the end of that so that when I slide the new seal on, any little sharp edges on the metal aren't going to scratch my seal. So that slides over there like that, undamaged. We can take that back off. Now I can put my washer and my bushes back together, knock this back into the outer. Right, so what I've got here is a seal hammer, and what that does is uses this end and it just pushes the seals back into the fork leg, and obviously the bushes that are above them have to get sort of pushed back into place as well, but this does the whole lot. It just sort of knocks everything back into place. So all we're going to do basically is slide that along there at a reasonable pace, knock the seals and bits back in, and then put the little circlip in down here. Job's a carrot. So we're making good progress now. My seals and bushes are all put back together, the tubes are together, I've bolted the cartridge back in, and now the next thing to do is to pour some fork oil in. I'm going to be using 5-weight Motul fork oil, and we need to set an air gap. When I built the bike a year and a half ago, I ran with a 130mm air gap, and it worked pretty well. But what I've realised is there's no bump stop in these forks, and I have bottomed the forks out a couple of times with maybe not the best wheelie landings and the occasional jump, and when they bottom out it's quite noticeable. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to make the air gap slightly smaller so that right at the bottom of the travel the air compression, like the air spring, gives it a bit more support. So I'm going to go with 120mm of air gap. It's not a big difference, but it will actually make quite a noticeable change. So we're going to do 120mm air gap. So what I've got to do first is pour the oil in, then I've got to pump my damper up and down so that I've got all the air out of everything. So it's only oil in the fork, and then you set the air gap with the cartridge completely compressed, the forks down, and the springs and spacers out. So in with the oil till we've got it fairly close to the top of the tube. There we go, I'm just sort of that far off the top, and then I'll just move that a couple of times to get a little bit of oil moving between the tubes. And then the important one, leading up the damper. And this may take a while because at the moment it's completely dry in there. So as I move it, I can just see air bubbles coming out of the oil, so that tells me the oil is replacing where the air used to be. But it may take a bit of pumping to fill the cartridge completely full of oil. So I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes for the air to sort of settle out of all that, and then I'm going to suck the excess of oil out. Right, I have my air gap setting tool, which is basically just a big sucker. That's bottomed, the tubes are bottomed, and then we just suck the excess oil up. Put the spring back in, put the preload spacer in, the little spacer that goes on the top of there, the preload washer, and then we can get the spring compressor wound down, get the fork top put on. So now that I have the spring compressed and all my spacer bits in, I can put my fork top back on, and I need to get this at the right height on the threaded tube on the damper rod, otherwise I won't have the right amount of adjustment on the rebound adjuster. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wind the adjuster in and out to make sure I've got the right amount of adjustment on the rebound, and if I need to I can loosen this nut off and wind the top cap up or down until we've got the right amount of adjustment, because what we don't want is the adjustment to be too big so that we'll never ever get the needle in the rebound stack to bottom, but we don't want it so tight that you can't take enough rebound damping off it, if that makes sense. Yep, I've got 4 turns of adjustment on that, which means I can wind it in and actually feel the adjuster bottoming in the hole in the rebound stack, so I know we can lock it off, and 4 turns out would be plenty, so that in effect we're winding it all the way out of the way. So I'm happy with that. I've locked my nuts together, which wasn't as painful as it sounds, and now I can just release the spring compressor and screw the outer back up to the top cap. Fork leg's done. So at the moment the rebound and the compression dampers are both wound all the way in, so we'll give it a bit of a push and see what it feels like. as you can see, that moves very, very slowly in both directions. So imagine if you were riding down a bumpy road with that, it would be terrible to ride on. So what we'll do is we'll wind the rebound all the way open, and the rebound will actually adjust both the rebound and compression. Because this is the piston that's moving and pushing the oil, if we open the bypass in it, oil can flow both ways past it. So it makes more difference on the rebound, but it will affect the compression as well. Right, so that's all the way open. And you can see there's still resistance on the compression. It still feels quite firm, but it moves. But coming back, it just sort of comes back pretty quickly. There is a little bit of control, but it comes back fairly quick. So the next thing to do is open the compression all the way up. See what difference that makes. And even with that, you can see how much easier that moves, but there is still some control to it. It's not a pogo stick, it isn't just bounce, bounce, bounce. There is control to it, but it is considerably easier to move. If we had to have one or the other, you would very, very definitely have it all the way open as opposed to all the way closed. Because closed would just be hideous. Right, that's one leg done. I best go and do the other leg. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time when I'm putting the Tuono back together.